During a company dinner for couples, my boss sat at my wife's table and kissed her, while I greeted other colleagues a few feet away. When I returned and saw the scene, the world seemed to stop. There were no screams. I simply left the ring on the table and left. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, forgive me, she said days later, no longer feeling the glow of certainty she'd felt that night. Her lover. He disappeared as soon as he realized there was no future there. She was left alone, surrounded by the weight of regret. After a while, I found a new love, someone who chooses me truthfully, every day, and from whom I learned that trust is the foundation. Years later, we met again. I said calmly, everything you've been through is forgiven. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It just means I'm moving forward lightly, on a path where betrayal no longer has a place. However, what this summary doesn't say, what no one imagines when reading this sequence of sentences, is how much the soul bleeds in silence when true love is destroyed before our eyes, without a chance to defend ourselves, without even a plausible explanation to justify what was done. I didn't scream because I couldn't find a voice. I didn't cry because I was paralyzed. I just stared at the scene, a quick kiss that lasted forever inside my head, and I knew, right then and there, that something that was only ours had been given to another man as if it had never meant anything. And perhaps what tore me apart the most wasn't the kiss, but the way she smiled immediately afterward, as if there was no guilt, as if that moment were a conquest. I didn't know if she already loved him, or if she had simply lost respect for me. But I understood, then and there, that our marriage had been buried by her without even warning me. In the car, driving aimlessly that night, only one question came to mind: when did she stop loving me? And worse, why did she never tell me? Why did she continue sharing the bed, making plans, talking about children, as if it were all still real? The betrayal didn't begin with the kiss. It began long before, in the silences, in the distances disguised as fatigue, in the nights when my cell phone was face down and I told myself it was all in my head. She called me crazy when I asked, laughed lightly, said I was the love of her life. And perhaps this was the cruelest part of all, she made me doubt my intuition, made me believe I was insecure, paranoid, while preparing the very theater where I would be the humiliated audience. And on the day of the dinner, she didn't even bother to hide it. She didn't wait for the end of the night, didn't care about the stares. She kissed my boss in front of co-workers, in a setting where I should have been respected. And when she saw me standing there, ring in hand, she didn't chase after me. She didn't beg. She just lowered her eyes. She had already made her choice. And the most devastating thing, it wasn't out of love. It was out of vanity. In the days that followed, her silence screamed louder than any confession. She didn't follow through. She didn't explain. Maybe she was waiting for me to explode so she could play the victim. But I just disappeared. I left the house. I left the family group. I didn't respond to the messages that came days later with empty phrases like, "It wasn't meant to be like this," or, "It was a mistake." I was confused. Confused? You don't kiss someone out of confusion. You kiss because you want to. Because you desire to. Because you decided, even if unconsciously, to hurt someone who would never do the same. And perhaps that was my greatest punishment at that time, knowing that I would give my life for her, while she gave mine up for nothing. But time, time. It doesn't heal, as they say. It only teaches us to live with the wounds. And it was precisely on this lonely road, marked by disappointments and silences, that I found someone. It wasn't immediate, nor planned. But someone appeared who looked into my eyes and saw me whole, even broken. Someone who didn't try to fix my pain, but sat beside me to feel it with me. A woman who said, "Everything will be okay," not as a promise, but as a presence. She chose me patiently. And it was this daily choice, simple but constant, that gave me back my breath. With her, I learned that trust isn't a detail, it's the foundation. I learned that love isn't about momentary intensity, but about permanence through the difficult days. She loved me in a way that made me understand I had never been truly loved before. Meanwhile, on the other side, the woman I once called my wife began to watch her own castle crumble. The man she'd thrown away her life for, disappeared. The illusion of a future turned to dust. No promises were kept. No plans came to fruition. What she imagined would be a fresh start became the beginning of her loneliness. Did she try to come back? Yes. After months, she showed up. She knocked on my door. She cried. She said she still loved me, that she regretted it. That she was weak. That she couldn't measure what she'd lost. But in that moment, looking into her eyes, I realized the love was gone. I felt no anger. No desire for revenge. I felt peace. A peace she no longer knew. I calmly told her, all is forgiven. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. She understood. The tears flowed unabated. Because there, finally, she understood that betrayal isn't repaid only with regret, but with the absence of return. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Because her true punishment wasn't losing me. It was seeing me start over. It was seeing me loved by someone who values me, who cares for me, who loves me wholeheartedly. It was understanding that she is now a memory that no longer hurts, but also no longer has space. She watches me from afar, trying to move on, trying to find what she threw away, but nothing has the same shine. No hug has the same feel. No look has the same meaning. Because some things, once lost, can never be found again. Not out of pride. But because the heart learns. And when it learns, it doesn't go back. What she discovered too late is that love that isn't cared for eventually tires. And when it tires, it's gone forever. But what really made her betray a marriage that seemed so solid? What was behind that smile at dinner? And what happened when she tried to rebuild her life with the man she thought was the right one? The truth behind betrayal isn't always in what you see. It's in the details, in the gaps, in the unspoken whys. And that's when everything becomes crueler. More human. More unforgivable. Because sometimes, those who betray, also betray themselves. Now, it's time to go back to the beginning. To reveal what was left unsaid. And understand, why someone would trade true love for an illusion. And how it can cost everything. Even their own heart. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any form of cheating. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on real emotions and choices, with a single mission, to show how betrayal destroys lives, hearts and futures. Prepare yourself. What you will hear, no, it's not just a story of love and loss, is a warning. A reminder that not every mistake allows for a return. Good story. And hold on tight. Because this will mess with you. Her name was Laura, and from their first encounters, she carried in her gaze a curious blend of sweetness and precision, as if every word she spoke had been measured before being uttered. She was the kind of woman who seemed to know exactly where she wanted to be, what she wanted to do, and with whom she wanted to share her days. Gabriel, on the other hand, had a more intuitive, less planned nature. He was gentle, patient, a man of silent gestures, the kind who carries the weight of loyalty as an absolute principle, not a momentary choice. When they met, it was as if two distinct worlds found an unlikely fit. Laura brought the drive, the restlessness, the desire to soar. Gabriel was the root. He was a safe haven. And, for a time, this difference between them was precisely what united them so strongly. The two met at a charity event, still in the early years of their professional careers. She was a public relations officer for an organization that hosted social events with local businesspeople. He was a financial analyst invited to speak on home economics. Nothing about that encounter seemed destined to become history. But it did. Amidst the formality of the speeches, the glasses of cheap wine, and the practiced smiles, there was an unpretentious conversation that began with a joke about the canapés and ended with the two sitting on the parking lot curb, laughing loudly like teenagers, with their shoes in hand and time forgotten. There were no vows, no promises, just a silent certainty between them that this night was the beginning of something. Over time, the relationship took shape and substance. Gabriel proved to be a profoundly stable man, the kind who listens before responding, who prefers resolution to argument. Always willing, always present. He wasn't made of grand gestures, but of constancy. Laura, in turn, was charming in the way she told stories, in the way she dedicated herself to projects and to life. She was demanding, of herself and the world, and sometimes gave in to frustration when things didn't go her way. Gabriel understood these impulses as part of her temperament and tried to compensate with more presence, more support. And so, the balance was built, day after day, built more on silence and respect than effusive declarations. They married after 4 years of dating. It was a simple ceremony, but full of meaning. Close friends, family, a softly sunny afternoon, and promises made with teary eyes. For Gabriel, that was the most important day of his life. He saw in Laura not only the woman he loved, but the future he had chosen to build. And despite the small differences between them, he never doubted they were moving in the same direction. Their life together began with the routine so many couples know, renting their first apartment, fighting over small things, the joy of buying their first furniture together, lazy Sundays, impromptu dinners after a tiring day. But there were also profound, intense moments, conversations that lasted until the early hours of the morning, laughter that seemed too much to contain inside the house. And even through the difficulties, there was a silent pact to carry on. Gabriel was always attentive. He remembered dates, tastes, and mannerisms. He knew exactly how she liked her coffee, which part of her body ached when stress set in, when she needed silence, and when she simply needed a cuddle. Laura, on the other hand, had her own unique ways of loving. Extremely organized and meticulous, she found a way to show affection in the details. She liked to prepare his favorite meals when she noticed he was exhausted, planned surprise trips to break the routine, bought books, and left notes hidden in the pages. They had their own code, made of looks and signals that only they understood. And for a time, all of this seemed enough to hold the world together. But time inevitably began to stretch between them. Routine took on new demands. Laura grew professionally, was promoted, began traveling more, attending dinners, events, and meetings until late. Gabriel supported everything, of course. Always had. He was never one of those men who bothered with his partner's success. On the contrary, he was proud of her. But little by little, he began to feel her absence in the spaces that were once theirs alone. The sofa that once welcomed them at the end of the day now welcomed him alone. The dining table, once noisy with conversation, was now silent, with him and the television. Laura tried to compensate when she could. She said it was a phase, that things would soon work out. But fatigue, distance, and the increasingly curt answers began to create small cracks. He didn't complain. He'd never been one to demand anything. But he felt it. And yet, he made a point of showing love every day. Flowers, messages, breakfasts ready. She, in turn, began to change her schedules, her priorities. Weekends now involved informal meetings, social events, often with coworkers he didn't even know. And although she said it was all for them, that every effort was to build a better life, Gabriel felt something slipping through his fingers. A kind of distance that had nothing to do with space, but with presence. With choice. The conversation between them continued, but there was less truth, less vulnerability. The smiles remained, but her eyes seemed increasingly empty. Even so, Gabriel didn't give up. He believed that every relationship went through phases. That love was also made of weathering storms. It wasn't the gestures that worried him, but the lack of sparkle in her eyes when she saw him. The connection that had once been instantaneous now needed to be forced. But he persisted, patiently, hopefully. He began cooking more elaborate dinners, suggesting short trips to rekindle their intimacy, proposing cell phone-free nights, just the two of them. Laura accepted, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with annoyance. She said she was tired, that work was demanding, that she needed time for herself. Gabriel accepted. He always accepted. Communication between them never completely ceased. But it had changed. She talked more about her projects, about career challenges, about how much she was in demand. He listened attentively, but wondered where the woman who daydreamed about children's names was, with whom he shared playlists for trips they never took, with whom he exchanged texts in the middle of the afternoon just to say she missed him. That woman still seemed there, but distant, like an edited version of herself. Gabriel wanted to believe it was just a phase, but deep down, he was beginning to fear it was something more. And then came the invitation to the company dinner. It was an elegant annual event where employees could bring their spouses. Laura insisted that Gabriel go, even though she knew he wasn't particularly fond of that kind of atmosphere. She said it would be good for him to get to know her colleagues better, who were all curious to know who the quiet and invisible husband she spoke of so proudly was. Gabriel reluctantly accepted. He knew it was important to her. And perhaps, somewhere in his heart, he saw it as a chance to salvage something. To remind them both of what still existed between them. That night, he dressed carefully. He chose the shirt she said she liked. He sprayed on a perfume he knew made her smile. He arrived at the imposing hall with a mixture of anxiety and hope. He saw her across the room, surrounded by colleagues, laughing, light, dazzling. Her eyes met his for a second. She smiled. And in that moment, Gabriel felt a brief breath of certainty that there was still room for them. That time could, indeed, be regained. He didn't yet know that that night would mark the silent end. Not a declared, abrupt end. But the end that begins as a fissure, a shadow that slowly creeps in until it covers everything. He just knew he was there, present, trying. Because when you love, you try until the end. Even when you no longer see answers. Even when everything inside you screams that something has changed. Gabriel didn't yet know that sometimes love dies slowly, and that when you finally realize it, it's already too late to save what was buried alive. And that night, as the music played and glasses clinked amidst smiles, fate silently began to prepare the exact moment when everything would fall apart. But for now, there was still hope. There was still room to believe. Even though the heart already knew, deep down, that something precious was slipping away. And no one was trying to hold on. Gabriel spent the week leading up to the dinner with a strange unease he couldn't name. It was as if something inside him was silently whispering that something was about to shift. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a restlessness that arose out of nowhere and spread slowly, like a cold wind blowing through a forgotten window. Laura, on the other hand, seemed excited. She'd chosen her dress days in advance, booked a salon appointment, her makeup appointment, and discussed her hairstyle with almost youthful enthusiasm. There was a lightness about her that Gabriel hadn't seen in a long time, and this, instead of reassuring him, made him even more confused. Was she, finally, resuming the pleasure of life with him? Or was it just a disconnected joy, unrelated to him? On the night of the event, he watched her descend the stairs and had an involuntary urge to smile. She was beautiful, as always. But there was something different in her eyes, an almost nervous gleam, as if hiding an unspoken anxiety. He complimented her, and she thanked him with a quick kiss, then headed to her car. On the way, she talked about the hall's decor, the guests, and how wonderful it was to see the company grow and gain recognition. Gabriel listened attentively, but his mind was elsewhere. There was something in her tone that sounded rehearsed, almost automatic. It bothered him, but he chose not to comment. He didn't want to ruin the evening she had so thoroughly planned. Upon arriving at the ballroom, the atmosphere was sophisticated, filled with warm lights and laughter masked by glasses of wine. Laura's colleagues welcomed them warmly. Gabriel made an effort to blend in, smiling and asking questions, but felt out of place. Laura, for her part, seemed perfectly at ease. She walked confidently between the tables, greeting everyone with hugs that lasted a few seconds, laughter that was too loud, and an enthusiasm that, in another context, would be admirable. Gabriel tried not to see malice where there might have been only extroversion. But the longer the night wore on, the more he felt something was slipping away from his control. At one point, Laura was called by a coworker, who tugged her arm with a certain intimacy to introduce her to a group of executives. Gabriel remained behind, alone at the bar, watching from afar. He saw her approach a tall man in a dark suit, whom he didn't know. The two greeted each other with a silent smile, unlike the others. A smile with a history. Gabriel felt a chill in his stomach. The man pressed his face against hers, and the kiss on the cheek lasted longer than necessary. She smiled. Then they parted. He didn't know who it was, but there, in that moment, something in his body reacted as if it knew. This wasn't friendship. This was a sign. Still, he chose to swallow the feeling. The night went on. Dinner was served, speeches were made, toasts were proposed. Gabriel was talking to a couple in front of him when he realized Laura was no longer beside him. He looked around, searching for her among the tables, when he saw her, sitting next to the same man, further back. They were too close. She was smiling like she hadn't smiled in ages. He was whispering something in her ear, and she leaned in, touching his arm lightly. Gabriel stood still, watching the scene like someone watching an accident in slow motion. He considered going over, interrupting, making a joke, anything. But he remained paralyzed. The world, in that instant, seemed to empty around him. Trying to push away the thought that was hammering away inside her, she walked over to a group of colleagues and began chatting, forcing a smile, feigning an interest she didn't feel. She spoke, but her eyes kept returning to the table where she was sitting. And then it happened. Quick, discreet, but definitive. The man turned to her, said something, and kissed her. It wasn't a scandalous kiss. It was restrained, as if they knew they shouldn't. But it was real. Gabriel saw it. He didn't imagine it. And what hurt most wasn't the act itself, but what came after. Laura didn't push him away. She didn't stand up. She didn't scream. She simply accepted it. With her eyes wide open. Like someone who had crossed that line before. The glass slipped from Gabriel's hand and fell to the floor with a loud thud. There was no scandal, no scene. Just a silence that cut through his chest. He walked slowly toward the table, with measured steps, trying to understand if this could still be reversed, if there was still room for some kind of explanation. But halfway there, he stopped. It no longer made sense. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. He removed the ring from his finger, calmly, as if returning something that no longer has value, and left it on the table in front of them. Her eyes widened but said nothing. The man stepped back slightly, disconcerted. Gabriel simply turned and walked away. Without looking back. Without needing anything else. In the days that followed, emptiness filled the house. Laura tried to contact him. She sent messages, left notes, called. At first, Gabriel didn't respond. Then, when he finally did, he limited himself to a single sentence: "You don't need to explain yourself. You did what you wanted." She insisted. She wanted to talk. She wanted to justify herself. She said it was a time of confusion, that things were difficult, that she felt alone. Gabriel listened. And replied, coldly, "I felt alone too. The difference is that I didn't reach out to anyone." She cried. She said she still loved him. That she didn't know how it had happened. That she hadn't planned it. Gabriel no longer believed her. It didn't matter if it had been planned or not. The truth was, there was a chasm between them that she chose to ignore. And instead of reaching out to rebuild, she jumped. She chose to fall. And the cruelest thing of all was that she seemed surprised by the outcome. Time passed, but the pain remained. Gabriel moved house. He changed his route. He even changed the paths he used to take, so he wouldn't have to remember. But inside, he kept trying to put the pieces of himself back together. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night with the weight of that image, the two of them sitting, smiling, complicit. That scene stuck in his memory like an indelible stain. But he didn't let it consume him. Little by little, he got his life back. He got his work back. He got his routine back. And, even with my heart broken, I still believed I could trust again. Not in her, but in life. What he didn't yet know was that behind that kiss lay more than one mistake. There was a story. A sequence of choices and lies that hadn't yet come to light. And what came next would not only confirm his pain, but show that there was something even deeper hidden beneath the lines of betrayal. Something that would change everything. Forever. Laura didn't wait for another answer. After weeks of silence and distance, she appeared at Gabriel's apartment door, her face drawn, her eyes tired from sleepless nights, and her body filled with an almost childlike anxiety. She carried a small backpack on her back, her expression a mix of guilt, despair, and a faint hope that still lingered deep in her soul. He opened the door slowly, without surprise, as if he had already expected, somewhere within himself, that this visit would happen. For a moment, they stared at each other without saying anything. There was no trace of love left in his eyes. Only serenity. And that calm was the first blow she felt. More than if he had yelled, cried, or sent her away. His indifference pierced her like a knife. She asked to come in. He hesitated, but relented. He sat on the sofa, the same one they'd shared for years, now with new pillows, no longer smelling like before. She looked around and saw that everything was cleaner, more organized, clearer. He was rebuilding his life. And there was no trace of her there. She sat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap, struggling to contain the trembling in her fingers. She began to speak. She said she hadn't slept well since dinner. That she thought about everything she'd experienced with him every day. That the kiss hadn't meant what it seemed. That it was a mistake, an impulse, a foolish attempt to feel alive, admired. She tried to explain that she felt invisible, suffocated by a routine that no longer thrilled her. That the other man appeared as an escape, not as love. Gabriel listened to everything in silence, his eyes fixed on her, without interrupting. And when she finished, he asked in a low, firm, and direct voice, "What exactly did you come here expecting?" She swallowed, tried to smile, and said she didn't know. That perhaps she was hoping to be heard. Perhaps forgiveness. Perhaps, a chance. He crossed his arms, took a deep breath, and replied that he didn't hate her. That the hurt was there, yes, but he had already begun to let it go. He said what hurt wasn't just the betrayal, but the way she made him seem like he meant nothing anymore. And that this kind of brokenness can't be mended with words, or promises. She was silent for long seconds, until she murmured that there was more. That it wasn't just a kiss. That she needed to tell him everything. Gabriel stared at her, his face inwardly startled, but without showing it. He asked her to speak. And she began. She explained that, before that dinner, her relationship with the other man had been going on for a few months. That their first kiss had happened at a conference out of town, during one of her work trips. She said she hadn't planned it, that things just happened, that she found herself drawn in, and when she tried to stop, it was too late. Gabriel didn't move. He just listened. But the tension in his shoulders slowly began to lift. Laura continued, now with tears in her eyes. She revealed that her lover had promised to leave his wife. That they had even talked about starting their life together again. That, at one point, she believed she could be happy with him. Gabriel clenched his fists, still silent, but something in his posture indicated something was about to break. Then she began to fall apart. She said everything changed after dinner. That the other man, upon seeing the scene, upon noticing that Gabriel hadn't made a fuss, that he'd simply handed over the ring and left in silence, realized there would be no drama, no dispute, and most importantly, no future. That the next day, her lover simply disappeared. He stopped responding to messages. He requested a department transfer. And, at the end of the week, he sent a curt email, saying he'd been hasty, that he wasn't ready to destroy his own family. Laura said she felt like trash. That the man she'd thrown away years of history for simply discarded her as if nothing had happened. Gabriel interrupted her, for the first time, with a cutting tone. He said that the worst part wasn't that. It was that she'd chosen to live this entire story behind his back, lacking the courage to end what they had before seeking someone else. That he could forgive a breakup, but not the drama. Laura lowered her head, sobbing, apologizing, saying she wanted to go back, that now she saw clearly everything she'd lost. But he stood. He walked to the window. He kept his back to her for a while. And, without turning his face, he asked, "Why now? Why did you only come back after he left you?" She couldn't answer. She murmured something about regret. About longing. Gabriel finally turned, his eyes firm, filled with silent pain, and said, "You didn't come back because you love me. You came back because he didn't stay. You're here because he was left. And I don't want to be the option of someone who only comes back when they're broken." She tried to touch him. But he pulled away. And then, as if delivering a final blow, he said he'd already met someone. He didn't want to talk about it now, but he thought it only fair to be honest. He said this new woman had appeared unhurriedly, without promises, just with a calm but firm presence. That it was with her that he relearned to smile. That it was with her that he felt peace. Laura was shocked. Her face drained of color. Her breathing became shaky. She tried to hide it, but failed. She asked for more details. She wanted to know if he already loved this woman. And he answered, without hesitation, yes. And the difference is that she truly chose me, every day, from the beginning. Laura stood up, completely unsteady. The tears were now flowing uncontrollably. She said this couldn't be happening. That she was the one who should be by his side. That it was just a mistake. That she was lost. Gabriel approached and, with disconcerting calm, said, "You lost me when you lied. And you lost me completely when you waited to be left to look for me." She lowered her face, humiliated, defeated, completely disconcerted. She tried to leave, but her legs seemed to give out. He helped her reach the door. She looked at him one last time, her eyes swollen, and said, almost in a whisper, "I never imagined losing you would hurt me more than his rejection." Gabriel took a deep breath and replied, "It's because what you lost, was real. And you don't find that twice." She left without looking back. The door closed slowly. Silence returned to the apartment. But it was a different silence. No heavier, no sadder. It was the silence of a man who had survived the pain, who hadn't allowed betrayal to define him. A man who was now walking toward a new love. But what Laura didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that her lover was also hiding a secret. And this secret, buried beneath all the promises, would soon come to light. Changing not only what had been experienced, but how everything would be remembered. 2 weeks had passed since that last conversation. Gabriel, even with his soul still reorganizing, allowed himself to breathe differently. The mornings had a lighter taste, not because of the absence of pain, but because he had finally understood that some wounds no longer need to be opened to prove they bleed. And while he began again, walking with firm steps toward what he called the future, on the other side of the city, Laura tried to put back together the pieces of a castle she herself had demolished. In the solitude of the apartment where she now lived, everything seemed to echo. The walls, the furniture, the drawers filled with mismatched socks. His absence was a glaring presence in every corner. The humiliation of being discarded by someone who had used sweet words to promise the world and then disappeared at the first sign of consequences corroded her days. But there was something even worse, the realization that the one who truly mattered, she herself had pushed away. One afternoon, after ignoring a string of messages on her cell phone for days, she received an unexpected call. It was the wife of the man she had cheated on. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. She asked to meet. She said she knew everything. And that there was something Laura needed to know. The invitation fell like a bombshell. She hesitated, considered refusing, but there was a weight in the woman's voice that Laura couldn't ignore. A sadness she now knew well. They arranged to meet later that afternoon, at a discreet cafe, away from familiar faces. When she arrived, she saw an elegant woman, younger than she had imagined, with eyes that didn't cry, but had already cried too much. The conversation began bluntly. The wife said she'd known everything for months. That she'd already sensed the distancing, the averted glances, the increasingly frequent excuses. And that she decided not to confront him. She observed. She analyzed. And, at the right time, she acted. Laura tried to defend herself, but was elegantly interrupted. I'm not here out of anger. I'm here because he did the same to me. But there's something you don't know. Something that might help you move on, not as consolation, but as truth. And then, with a calmness that contrasted with her content, the wife revealed that the man Laura had gotten involved with, had done it before. More than once. That there was a pattern. That each woman was a bridge to some ambition, a ladder to some position, a fantasy to feed his ego. And that Laura was just another one. The difference is that, with her, he nearly lost everything. Not out of love, but out of carelessness. Because she never imagined Gabriel would react with such silence, with such dignity, to the point of exposing the betrayal not with scandals, but with absence. She also said that, after dinner, the man panicked. Not because he regretted it. But because he realized that, by trying to win Laura over, he had caught the attention of important people in the company. And that was too risky for him. Laura, stunned, tried to absorb it all. Her wife's words hammered at the certainties she still held. And when she asked why she was revealing all this now, Laura replied with a sad smile, because neither of us deserved him. And maybe you need the truth to free yourself from the illusion. Sometimes, knowing the truth is what we need to forgive ourselves for loving wrongly. Laura left the cafe with shaky legs. For the first time, she could clearly see where she had placed herself. The love she thought she had experienced with that man, never existed. It was just need disguised as passion. Vanity disguised as novelty. And now, she had to deal with what she had truly lost, someone who had loved her completely. Someone who would have been by her side even in her darkest days, if she had chosen not to betray him. The pain was unbearable. But necessary. Days later, Gabriel walked through a cultural fair, accompanied by Sophia, the woman with whom he had been building something serene and new. She was different from Laura. Not prettier, not more interesting. Just different. Her gestures carried an effortless kindness. She was self-assured, but with a rare humility. She had the delicacy of someone who respects the past but lives in the present. With her, Gabriel felt no urgency to prove himself worthy. He simply was. And that, for someone who had once been torn apart inside, was everything. As they explored the booths, laughing at silly details, he received a message from Laura. Short. To the point. I need to see you. It's important. Gabriel showed his phone to Sophia, who merely nodded. There was no jealousy there. Only understanding. The next day, he found Laura in the park where they usually ran on Sundays. She was sitting on her usual bench, her eyes fixed on the ground. When he approached, she stood up but didn't hug him. There was no more room for that. She began by telling him about her encounter with the other man's wife. She said everything. The words came out with difficulty, as if they still hurt too much to say. Gabriel listened, serious but without anger. When she finished, he said he was sorry she had to go through that. But he didn't say anything else. Then, her voice breaking, she apologized. Not only for the betrayal, but for underestimating him. For thinking he'd be there, waiting, even after everything. She apologized for confusing love with guaranteed presence. And with tears now flowing freely, she asked if he was already happy with Sophia. Gabriel took a few seconds before answering. But when he did, he said yes. That the peace he felt now wasn't euphoria, nor an explosion. It was a calm he'd never known. And that, yes, that too was love. Laura nodded sadly. She said she understood. She wouldn't look for him anymore. That this conversation was the closure she needed. She asked only that he be happy. And that if he ever thought of her, it wouldn't be with hatred. Gabriel smiled melancholy and said he didn't hate. He was only grateful for what they had experienced. But now, he was living a different story. She stood, adjusted her bag, and said, I lost everything for something that never existed. But what hurts me most, is that you were able to rebuild. And I wasn't. He didn't answer. He just watched as she walked away, small on the horizon. In the following months, Gabriel and Sophia deepened their bond. They traveled, met each other's friends, and built new routines. She never asked him to forget the past, but offered a gift so full of truth that the past began to fade. Laura, on the other hand, kept trying. She changed companies, sought therapy, and reconnected with her family. But there was a void that no new achievement could fill. A kind of inner silence only known to those who held something rare in their hands, and let it slip away. Years later, their paths crossed again. A wedding between mutual friends. The hall was full, music played in the background, and laughter was light. Gabriel arrived accompanied by Sophia, now engaged. Laura, sitting alone at a table in the back, watched everything with a restrained smile. When their eyes met, he walked over to her. Their greetings were cordial. There was maturity on both their faces. Laura looked at him and said, "You're fine." Gabriel replied, "Yes. I'm at peace." She then thanked him. He said that, despite everything, she had learned from him the value of true love. And that if she ever encountered something similar, she would know how to care for it. He smiled. And, with the serenity that only time can offer, he said, "Everything that happened is forgiven. But forgiveness doesn't mean going back. It just means I'm moving forward lightly, on a path where betrayal no longer has a place." And then he turned. He walked to Sophia, took her hand, and together they walked to the dance floor, where they laughed and mingled with the guests, celebrating a life that didn't begin with an outburst, but with reconstruction, truth, and choice. Laura, sitting alone, didn't cry. But she felt. She felt everything she'd never felt before at the right time. And now, all that was left was to remember. Because certain stories, once lost, can't be repeated. They simply become lessons. The reunion between Laura and Gabriel at that wedding left silent scars that reverberated for weeks. There was no argument, no harsh words, no explicit hurt. But there was an invisible line that separated them definitively, and it was made of everything that could no longer be said. Gabriel returned home that night with his heart calm but silent, still touched by what he felt in Laura's eyes. It was no longer love, nor desperate regret. It was something else, a kind of melancholy that arises when one finally understands they've lost something that can never be rebuilt, even if time goes back. And that was precisely what made everything so complex. Because forgiveness is simple when the pain is raw, when the hurt still burns, because rejection justifies distancing. But when the wound heals, when the heart learns to beat without stumbling over the other's name, forgiveness becomes an act of mercy that frees those who suffered, and condemns those who caused it. Gabriel forgave her. Not for her, but for himself. And that was exactly what crushed her. In the days that followed, Laura continued to live her life in an almost robotic way. Work continued, responsibilities continued, demands came from all sides, but deep down, she knew something within her had ended. She tried other encounters, conversations, even let herself be involved with one or two people who expressed interest, but in each situation, there was an invisible wall she couldn't overcome. And this wall was made of comparison. Not with Gabriel as a man, but with what they had experienced. The feeling of emotional security, of silent complicity, of genuine partnership. None of that was found in the new perspectives that emerged. And no matter how hard she tried, nothing fit as before. It wasn't idealization. It was a lack of truth. She began attending a therapy group, where she shared fragments of her experience with strangers. She didn't use names, she didn't share details, but gradually she realized that her story hurt others in ways she hadn't anticipated. One night, after a particularly intense session, a woman told her that the cruelest part of betrayal isn't the loss of trust, but the death of reciprocity. Because when one loves and the other lies, there's a misalignment that shatters the relationship's identity. Laura heard this and broke down. She cried there, in front of everyone, not for the man she lost, but for the woman she no longer was. She could no longer see herself the same way. She had become the version of herself she once swore she would never be. And no motivational phrase could erase that. Gabriel, on the other hand, continued with Sophia, building what they called an honest future. There was no idealization between them. They knew each other's pain. Sophia never bothered by Laura's silent presence in Gabriel's past, because she understood that a man only carries weight when he hasn't yet faced it. And he had faced it. Sophia also had her scars, and perhaps that was what united them so much. It wasn't a lack of history. It was the maturity of someone who knew the value of loving consciously. Of not betraying, not out of fear, but by choice. The two began planning a new phase. A move to a more remote house, away from the hustle and bustle of the old neighborhood, where Gabriel could breathe a different air. They made simple plans. A vegetable garden in the backyard. A dog. And unhurried nights. It was a new routine, but one that held a beauty he'd never known before. Meanwhile, Laura avoided the places where she knew she might cross paths with him. Not out of embarrassment, but because she understood there was no more room. And she no longer wanted to be an uncomfortable memory in the life of someone who had learned to smile without her. Little by little, she began to channel her pain into something meaningful. She wrote texts, attended seminars on relationships and emotional ethics. She became a discreet but firm voice among people seeking understanding amid the chaos of feelings. Did it still hurt? Yes. But it was a pain with a purpose. And that made a difference. The complexity of what had happened between them lay not only in the act of betrayal, but in what had unfolded. Gabriel hadn't just lost a wife. He'd temporarily lost confidence in his own judgment. And Laura hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost the opportunity to mature alongside someone willing to grow with her. And this moral dilemma was the most difficult to navigate. Because belated regret never finds refuge in the hearts of those who have already built another piece. And forgiveness, though noble, doesn't reverse trajectories. One day, Laura was invited to speak at an event about new beginnings and emotional choices. She accepted reluctantly, but saw it as part of the rebuilding process. In her speech, she didn't mention names or specific episodes. But as she looked at the audience, she said something that resonated with everyone present: not every love story ends because of a lack of feeling. Some end because one of the parties forgets that loving also means protecting the other from our own instability. There was silence. A silence that weighed heavily. Because everyone knew that sentence wasn't theory. It was a scar. After the event, as she left, she sat alone on a bench outside and watched the people leave. She no longer felt angry at herself. But she also felt no relief. She was at a point where things simply were. And perhaps that was the closest thing to peace she would ever get. Gabriel, that same night, was having dinner with Sophia in their new house. The porch was lit by yellow lights, the distant sound of music playing on the radio, and they were chatting lightly about the day. At one point, she asked if he had forgiven everything. And he replied, without hesitation, I have. But forgiving isn't forgetting. It's just choosing not to carry that with me anymore. She smiled, took his hand, and said, and you chose me. He nodded. And in that moment, the weight was gone. The dilemma that remained for everyone was simple on the surface, but painful at its core. To what extent does a wrong choice define who we are? Is it possible to fully rebuild ourselves after destroying something precious? Can true love truly survive betrayal, or does it only endure until the wounds are too deep? Gabriel found his answer by refusing to harden himself. Laura found hers by accepting that not all forgiveness is a path back. And together, even though they were on different paths, they made it clear that some losses, however painful, are what allow us to evolve. But the story isn't over yet. Because love, even when wounded, always leaves seeds. And what each person does with them, is what determines whether what they experience will be just pain or also transformation. The weeks progressed with the same cold calm of winter days. The city, blanketed in a mild silence between gray mornings and cold nights, seemed to reflect exactly the emotional state each character found themselves in. Life had moved on again, but not with the same haste as before. Events, now settled, left traces more subtle than screams. Gabriel, firm in his routine with Sophia, began to feel the contours of a new stability solidify. There were no more hidden fears, no more unanswered questions. The past had found its place, a locked room, sometimes visited in thought, but from which nothing was removed. Still, certain memories surfaced uninvited, and this didn't make him weak, just human. There were days when, even in the face of present love, he felt the echo of scars. Not because he missed Laura, but because he missed the person he had been by her side. The man who believed that love alone was enough to keep someone close. He had learned that it wasn't. And that truth was bittersweet. In her new home, Sophia had set up a space to work with art. She painted in her spare time, and he would often watch her in silence as she patiently and affectionately colored canvases. There was something therapeutic about that habit. Gabriel would come over, sit beside her, and simply watch. He didn't need to talk. Just being there was enough. One afternoon, she was painting a canvas depicting a figure sitting by the sea, facing away, gazing at the horizon. Gabriel asked what it represented, and she replied that it was about the people we let go. She said that peace only comes when we understand that not everyone is meant to stay. Gabriel stared at the painting for a few seconds, then replied that perhaps true forgiveness was exactly that, wishing the other person would find meaning, even without us. She nodded. And in that moment, a kind of comfortable silence filled the air. On the other side of town, Laura was making plans to move. Not because she wanted to escape, but because she realized she needed a different setting to rebuild herself. The apartment she lived in, the places she frequented, everything around her still smelled of memories. She decided to accept a job offer in another region, something she'd been offered for months, but which she'd always turned down for fear of starting over. Now, fear was no longer an obstacle, it was an impulse. He was preparing to leave, without any big goodbyes, without fanfare. It was a silent goodbye, but loaded with meaning. An acknowledgement that, no matter how much one wishes, some stories can't be rewritten in the same place where they were erased. One night, before packing up her last books, she found an old notebook at the bottom of a box. It was a gift from Gabriel, early in their marriage. A leather-bound notebook where he encouraged her to write down her thoughts, dreams, and projects. On the first page was a dedication, so you don't forget everything you still are, even on the days when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Laura held the notebook in her hands for long minutes. The phrase, which had once seemed simple, now felt like a warning. The world had convinced her of many things, including that the love she had wasn't enough. And now she understood that love wasn't the problem. The problem was not realizing how precious it was until it was too late. She lay on the floor of the empty living room, notebook to her chest, and cried without resistance. But it was a clean cry, almost liberating. At the end of that week, before leaving, she decided to stop by a symbolic place one last time, the garden where Gabriel had proposed. She arrived late in the afternoon, with the sky tinged with gold. She sat on the same bench, looked around, and no longer saw the couple she once was. But she saw the woman she now was. And, for the first time, she didn't wish to go back in time. She simply wished that, wherever life took them, it would remain at peace. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and stayed there for a few minutes. When she opened them, an elderly couple was walking hand in hand toward the opposite bench. She smiled at them, and they smiled back. It was as if, somehow, life was telling her that love was still possible. Even if in another story. The next morning, she set off. She was beginning a new phase, without the hope of replacing what she'd lost, but with the strength of someone who had finally learned not to abandon herself. During the trip, she wrote a final message to Gabriel. Short, weightless, I'm gone. Thank you for everything. Carry on lightly. He read it while drinking coffee on the porch with Sophia. He didn't reply. He just smiled slightly and put away his phone. Sophia looked at him curiously. He simply said it was someone from the past saying goodbye. She nodded. And, without needing to elaborate, she held his hand under the table. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. The following week, during Sunday lunch with Sophia's parents, Gabriel was surprised by an unexpected conversation. Her father, a straightforward man, asked how he felt about building a new family, coming from a relationship that had left such deep scars. Gabriel thought for a few seconds before answering. He said the fear of not being enough had haunted him for a long time. That no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that Laura's betrayal didn't affect his worth, he still carried an inner voice whispering that perhaps he hadn't been good enough. Sophia's father listened silently, then replied that good people get betrayed too. And that this says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. Sometimes the most faithful are left behind because they don't know how to play games. But that's precisely why they deserve a love that isn't a board game. Gabriel kept those words. And they reverberated. That night, as they lay in bed, he told Sophia everything. She said nothing for a few minutes. Then she turned and hugged him tightly. You were never weak. You were whole. And you were betrayed because the world hasn't yet learned to deal with those who love without reservation. But now, you no longer need to prove anything. Just live. He smiled. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sleep soundly. Without ghosts. Without traces. Laura, in her new city, now lived in a small apartment with large windows, where the morning sun streamed in and the silence was comfortable. She spent her days working, reading, sometimes walking alone through unfamiliar streets. There was still no one new. And she didn't look for anyone. Not out of fear, but out of respect for her own process. One day, while wandering through a craft fair, she came across a curious painting, a woman with her back turned, sitting by the sea, staring at the horizon. It was the same image Sophia had painted months earlier, without Laura ever seeing it. She bought the canvas and hung it in her living room. She didn't know why, but there was something comforting about it. Maybe it was the symbolism. Maybe it was just coincidence. But the woman's gaze in the painting spoke more than words. Life went on. But now, without rushing. Gabriel and Sophia were planning a small wedding, just for close friends. There was no ostentation. There was truth. And truth, after the storm he'd lived through, was the greatest luxury anyone could have. Laura, with her silent nights and productive days, was now writing a book. Not about betrayal. But about choices. About how every misstep can lead us to a precipice, but can also push us toward reinvention. And this book wouldn't be about justifying mistakes. It would be about showing that those who make mistakes can also teach. As long as they have the courage to look in the mirror and not look away. The paths were set. Not parallel. But authentic. Because in the end, the greatest lesson of all that wasn't about winning or losing. It was about recognizing that even the most thoughtless decisions leave consequences that can't be erased, but can, indeed, be understood. And that sometimes, peace isn't in returning. It's in accepting that the page has turned, and continuing to write with greater awareness. Love, even if broken, hadn't ceased to exist. It simply found other bodies, other voices, other endings. Gabriel and Sophia's wedding took place on a spring morning, shaded by ancient trees surrounding a quiet, open field. There was no lavish party, no overflowing invitations, just the people who were part of their stories, present with teary eyes and genuine smiles. The ceremony was conducted by a mutual friend, and the words spoken there spoke not of eternal promises, but of daily choice, of mutual construction, of healing. Gabriel looked at Sophia as he said his vows and felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, the weight of mature love, one that comes not with urgency, but with awareness. A love that is sustained not by idealizing the other, but by the deep acceptance of who one is. When the final kiss sealed their union, there was no euphoric applause, only a light and beautiful silence, as if even time had stopped to acknowledge how well it was deserved. After the wedding, the two spent a few days traveling through the countryside, avoiding tourist spots, opting for small villages, hidden cafes, and leisurely trails. On these silent walks, in the glances exchanged at the dinner table, or when sharing the same blanket on cold nights, Gabriel found small certainties. He no longer needed to prove himself worthy of love, because there was someone there who saw who he was without him having to explain himself. He realized he no longer carried pain, anger, or remnants of his past. The past was in its rightful place, behind him. And even though it had shaped who he was, it no longer had the power to dictate his steps. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Laura went about her days at a pace that oscillated between stability and absence. The new city brought her new faces, new possibilities, and although she was building something solid professionally, there was still a persistent emptiness. It was no longer the emptiness of Gabriel's loss, but the emptiness of her own disconnection from the woman she once was. The nights were quiet, the commitments constant, but there was always a point where the silence screamed too loudly. She wrote frequently. The book was finally finished. It wasn't autobiographical, but each line carried pieces of her journey. Fragments of guilt, recognition, shame, and, finally, acceptance. When she delivered the manuscript to the publisher, she felt more vulnerable than ever. It was as if, by sharing this with the world, she was baring her soul, but also asking for forgiveness. A forgiveness she might never receive, but which didn't stop her from continuing. Months later, the book was released. It received positive reviews, praising the sensitivity and depth of the text. Readers sent emotional messages, saying they had seen themselves between the lines, that it had helped them understand their own worth. Laura read each of these messages with a mixture of relief and pain. Knowing that her story, even disguised, was helping others gave her some kind of peace. But it also made it clear that her pain was not unique. That so many people had already experienced irreparable losses caused by emotional oversights, by mistakes that could have been avoided. And this gave her purpose, but also a mirror. She didn't try to contact Gabriel again. She didn't seek out information about him, didn't look for any traces. She wanted to believe he was okay, and that was enough. But fate sometimes likes to tie up loose ends. One day, during a lecture on emotional ethics in relationships, Laura was surprised to spot a familiar face in the back of the auditorium. It wasn't Gabriel. It was his mother. Sitting with her arms crossed, attentive, firm. At the end of the event, she approached discreetly. She said she'd heard about the book, that she was there out of curiosity, but left with something more. Laura tried to hide her emotion, but the woman's presence unhinged her. Gabriel's mother held her hand for a few seconds and said that, for a long time, she'd been angry. That she couldn't understand how someone could betray a love as pure as her son's. But that, over time, she'd learned to distinguish error from essence. And that, there, before her, she saw a different woman. A woman who had paid the price. And who had perhaps already suffered enough. She didn't apologize. He didn't apologize. But he was grateful for the conversation. Laura cried when she was alone. Because that small spark of understanding was more than she expected. Time, with its relentless way of transforming pain into memories, took its course. Gabriel and Sophia had a daughter. A simple name, but with a beautiful meaning, Clara. Because that's how he felt with her by his side. Fatherhood brought out a new layer of Gabriel. A kind of love he hadn't known, but which filled him completely. When he held Clara in his arms for the first time, he remembered everything he'd experienced and smiled. Because, in the end, every fall, every scar, every tear had brought him here. And even though he wasn't proud of what he'd been through, there was gratitude for the man he'd become. Years passed. Laura never remarried. She had other relationships, some intense, some fleeting. But none of them became a home. And she accepted that. She learned to enjoy her own company, to be self-sufficient. In an interview about the book, a journalist asked her if she regretted anything. She thought for a moment before answering, "I regret having loved rightly but acted wrongly." And sometimes, love isn't enough when the fear of facing the truth is greater than the courage to fight for what you have. The phrase circulated on social media. It became a reference. But for her, it was simply the raw truth. One autumn afternoon, walking alone through a bookstore, Laura found a photography book featuring landscapes from various countries. As she leafed through it, she saw an image, a beach with a single person sitting with their back turned, gazing out at the sea. She smiled. It was almost identical to the painting she'd bought years ago. And in that smile was peace. Because life hadn't given her back what she'd lost, but it had given her understanding. And that, for some, is everything. Gabriel, now with subtle wrinkles and calm eyes, loved to write letters to his daughter, even when she couldn't read. He kept them all in a box. One of the letters read, "Never settle for less than the love that truly chooses you. Because one day, I was almost forgotten by someone I thought would love me forever. But today, I know, those who truly love don't turn away at the first doubt. And you, daughter, deserve the kind of love that lasts. Always." And so, between new beginnings, silences, and choices, everyone's paths continued. Not all happy, but all true. And, in the end, what remained was the certainty that betrayal destroys more than a relationship. It destroys trust, disfigures bonds, shatters self-image, and sometimes, even with regret, what was lost can no longer be touched. Because love is not eternal when left untended. It grows sick. And sometimes, it dies. Now that the story has come to an end, we want to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this journey? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the characters, their decisions, and their outcome. Subscribe to the channel and don't miss the next stories that promise to stir your emotions. Remember, here, we do not condone any kind of betrayal. This channel exists to tell fictional stories that show how betrayal destroys loves, families, and futures. And that every choice, no matter how small, carries the power to change everything. Think about this before betraying the trust of someone you love. Because love, when betrayed, can even be forgiven, but it rarely returns.